Torah tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Tziva lanu Moshe, tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Tziva lanu Moshe, tziva lanu Moshe Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Yai lalai, yai lalai lalai, yai lalai lalai lai, yai lalai lalai, yai lalai yai. Come on, Sonny, sing with me. Yai lalai lalai, yai lalai lalai, yai lalai lalai, yai lalai yai. By the light, by the Torah's eternal light, lie la lie, lie la lie, lie lie la lie, hiddy die die die, lie la la lie, yai la lie, yai la lie, yai la lie, die 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 die, hiddy die die die. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, the Torah that Moshe received and then passed it on to us. It is our heritage. It is our Yerusha. So this word, Natan, you know, it's a palindrome, just like the word tasat. That's an inside joke to some of us here. Natan is a palindrome, and this is the time of the giving of Torah. What happened at Sinai? I don't know. But a story was told, was it not? Let me take that away. A story was told. A story that has sustained us for 4,000 years. All of the storytellers that you're going to be hearing this evening are my friends. They're my teachers. They're my colleagues. And one of them is my wife. That's for you to figure out. One of them is celebrating with me our 32nd wedding anniversary. That's the same person on July 4th. Will it be at Kala? And hopefully many of you will be there too at the biennial, I think that's what it is, Jewish Renewal Gathering. One person I've known for a long, long time is the co-founder of the Multi-Faith Storytelling Institute. With Renée and Shulamit Fagan, we teach people who work in sacred settings, chaplains and rabbis and chazanim and spiritual directors, how to use stories in a sacred setting. If you're interested about that, be in touch with us. But without further ado, I give you my friend, Shulamit Fagan. Let's all give her a little round of applause. Shulamit!
Wow, thank you so much. It's just absolutely a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I am about to share a story with you that came through me about 3 years ago, right about this time of the year. I will leave it up to you to decide whether or not this is a true story. And it is a story about Shavuot, which we know is the holy day when we all stood at Sinai and Moses brought us the Torah. It's said that the mountain shook violently with God's presence and people could hear the lightning and see the thunder, and the mountain was full of fire. Well, it is the day of Revelation, and this is how it was for me right after we got out of Egypt. We had been in the desert for a little while. I've lost track of time because it doesn't really seem to be very important. After all, we have the cloud, and when the cloud moves, then we move. And we have Moses, who brings us mitzvot and Torah. And I have my husband, who's a very kind and lovely guy, but he tells me what to do too. So I guess basically I'm really good for making beautiful babies and taking care of people and being in this world. However, during all of this time, as happy as most of us are, we're also a little restless and maybe a little fearful. We haven't known this God for very long. What if he takes his manna and leaves? Well, during all of this, it seemed like there was a little restlessness, and it kept growing. My sister whispers to me that we need to go to Sinai with everyone. Okay, I'm willing to do that. Before long, it's no longer whispered and it's no longer gossip. This is what we're supposed to do. We are instructed to bathe, put on clean robes, go all together, march to the biggest mountain that we can see. We make quite a sight as we're walking towards Sinai. Suddenly someone starts a little chant, and the chant grows and grows. It feels like it sort of washes over me. I have my little daughter by the hand. She looks up at me and says, "Mama, look at that mountain. It's glowing." And it is. It seems to me it's glowing with love, with beautiful white light. And as we get closer, the ground begins to rock very gently. And suddenly I can feel the flowers growing. And I can see, without a doubt, that mountain is not on fire. It has great light coming out of it. Suddenly I can also smell the moon. It smells like love. In fact, everywhere I look, I'm engulfed in that love. And the light, I'm not afraid. My feet are planted firmly on the ground, and my heart is open. The garden of resonance is glowing. I hear a voice that says, "This is where you live. It will not look like this in your physical eye, but this is where you live. You are good and whole and worthy of the spark of me that lives in you. Fan that spark with gratitude, and I will fill your heart with love and your life with joy." The next thing I remember, we're walking back to our tents, and everyone around me is very disturbed because they say the mountain shook, and they could hear the lightning, and they could see the thunder, and they are just really upset. Finally, Moses comes down and brings us new mitzvot to remember. You can imagine how I might have felt because my version was so different than the people around me. While I told you my husband's very kind, I don't talk to him about mystical things. So it wasn't until later in that month when I sat in the tent with my women friends that I was able to ask what kind of experiences they had. One of my sisters said, "The butterflies were so beautiful, luminescent golden. I could smell the moon. The most intimate smell came from it, inviting me closer and closer. And the air, well, the air just tasted like love. The voice of a woman with the most ethereal presence whispered, 'I am Shekhinah.' and I am Sophia, and I am you. Move out in strength and joy. My heart cried out in massive joy. I wasn't alone. Some of my holy sisters had gentle experiences of brilliant light, of love all through. Wisdom trees that offered strength, and birds that whispered wisdom. And through it all, in it all of it was love. We talked for hours. We sat together and we evoked that love star among us. We prayed great gratitude and sang praise. We wondered how such different experiences could happen at the same time, in the same place. And then we returned to gratitude and wonder. We are living into our truth, the truth that we experienced. May we all know our truth and live into it with love. The one constant for all of us in all our stories is love.
Yai la la la, di 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 di, yalla di di di. Thank you, Shulamit. Ya la 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 la, di 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 di, la 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 na 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 na. This is me with my Rabbi, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, of blessed memory. The first of the Aseret HaDibrot, of the 10 utterances, more commonly known as the 10 Commandments that we received, begins, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. One of Reb Zalman's brilliances is that he helped us reconceptualize our relationship with divinity and how we talk about the Holy Blessed One. Reb Zalman was a teacher of Rabbi Rami Shapiro, and in the tradition of his teacher, Reb Zalman, Rami unpacks Yud He Vav He, most commonly pronounced as Adonai, as the unnamed and unnameable reality, the source and substance of all being and becoming. I'll say that again. The unnamed and unnameable reality, the source and substance of all being and all becoming. I guess that is what MOSh downloaded, who MOSh downloaded from on that day 4,000 years ago. All of the tellers tonight had a personal relationship with Reb Zalman, including our next teller, Rabbi Dan Goldblatt, the only rabbi I know who has a city named after him in which he lives in. From Danville, California. Welcome, Reb Dan.
Thank you, Mark. Chag Sameach. A sacred story of Shavuot. When I was a boy, I went to a yeshiva, a Jewish school where we had Jewish studies in the morning and regular school studies in the afternoon. In the morning, we studied Torah. In the 4th grade, we began studying Talmud, the great debates among the rabbis about what Torah and Jewish spiritual practice might mean to us in our lives. Near the end of every school year, around the time of the holiday of Shavuot, the holiday in which we celebrate Matan Torah, the receiving of Torah, we had a big school program, and every class put on some kind of performance. Every year, we spent time studying what the Torah has to say about what happened on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai. It always amazed me that there really isn't very much detail about what happened at that moment of great mystery. The verse from Parshat Yitro says, Vayhi kolot uvrakim v'anan kaved al hahar. There was thunder and lightning with a heavy cloud on the mountain. In the Midrash, we learn that Rabbi Akiva taught that our people saw the thunder and heard the lightning. That there was a powerful universal experience of synesthesia, where sensory experiences are not chosen but happen automatically without effort. In this moment of where words cannot describe what people experienced, our tradition simply says that there was this profound shift in reality. Our senses embrace the shift and propel us into an alternate state of consciousness. You know, from the first time I heard this midrash, it stayed with me. It got into my kishkes. It seemed to fully embrace my neshama. When I was in the 4th grade, we were going to put on a play about Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, at the top of Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah. We were going to create a large mountain out of paper mache, and the person who got to play Moses would stand on a large platform, 20 feet in the air, behind the paper mache mountain, and get to sing a song about receiving the Torah. Now, everyone in my class wanted the part of Moses. But you had to audition, you had to win the part. Now, we had some boys in my class that had some really nice voices. There was one boy in particular named Eliyahu Katz, who had this incredibly sweet voice, melodic, beautiful voice. I had the misfortune of having Eliyahu audition right before me. The song we had to sing contained the words that were put to the melody of Avinu Malkeinu. Most of us know the melody from the Yamim Noraim, the High Holy Days. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu. And so Eliyahu sang, and his sweet voice filled the room. Everyone, including me, thought he was a shoo-in. He was going to be Moshe at the top of the mountain for our class presentation. But you see, I had learned this melody, Avinu Malkeinu, sitting next to my Zaidi, my grandfather, during the Yamim Noraim, the High Holy Days. Now you have to understand, my Zaidi did not have a great voice, but his prayers, his tefillah, was very powerful because he sang from a very deep place. I remember one year I was sitting next to him in shul, and I asked him, Zadie, you don't have the most beautiful voice of all, but when you sing your prayers, they are so beautiful. What is your secret? He said to me, my own father taught me to pray. And when he prayed, he simply opened himself up to the Ruach Elohim, to the breath of God breathing through him. Every breath we draw, my Zadie said, is the breath of God. Every breath we draw in prayer is the breath of God. But we don't often tune into that. But when we do, our prayers can become so powerful. Before I stood up to audition, I heard my Zadie's words echoing in my heart. I closed my eyes. I tried with all my strength to tune into the breath of God breathing through me. The Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One of Blessing. I don't remember ever opening my eyes, but I felt that breath coming through me. Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu, Chonenu va'anenu, Ki en banu masim. That day, my voice was not the most beautiful, but because I was able to tune into the Ruach Elohim, the breath of God breathing through me, I think that all the boys and my Rabbi, my teacher, sensed the power of my prayer. It was lovely to play Moses in that play, but it was much more important to discover a deeper way into prayer and let the God breath breathe through me. That Shavuot, I learned something about the mystery, about how our people saw the light, the thunder, and heard the lightning. It was a Shavuot I will never forget.
Thank you, Rabbi Dan. Rabbi Dan is in Danville, California, and our next two tellers are in Asheville, Oregon.
Ashland.
Ashland, thank you. Asheville is in North Carolina. It would be good there too. Thank you, Renee. They are a dynamic duo. There are many dynamic duos, such as Batman and Robin. Dynamic duo. Of course, there are many, many more, and I think Reb David would appreciate this one, Gerrig and Ruth, or Ruth and Gerrig. Then, of course, is this dynamic duo, Bert and Ernie. And all humor or attempt at it anyway aside, this is also a dynamic duo, and I want to pay my respects to the late Chazan Jack Kessler with his wife, Rabbi Marcia Prager. So, like I said, from Ashland, Oregon, Rabbi David Zaslow and Devra Zaslow are, to me, in the same way that Reb Marcia and Chazan Jack, Zichrona Livracha, models of what a couple can be. And besides, not only is Reb David obviously a rabbi, but he is one of the last remaining great Brooklyn Dodger fans. And if you ever visit him in Ashland, he'd be happy to show you the shrine to Jackie Robinson. So first we'll hear from David, and then directly after from Devra. Let's give them a warm MOSh welcome.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mark. What an honor it is for us to be here. Reb Zalman, may he rest in peace, taught us by example the potential for healing that can come from deep interfaith encounters, not just learning about other spiritual faiths, but experiencing them directly. So for today's Shavuot gathering, I decided to share with you an interfaith story that you may not have heard before. In the winter of 2008, I organized a Shabbaton for Reb Zalman and Eve on the Big Island of Hawaii. And in the spirit of the way to do interfaith work that I learned from Reb Zalman, I looked for a Hawaiian spiritual leader who might want to co-lead a blessing ceremony with Reb Zalman to help us welcome in Shabbat. Well, I made contact with a Hawaiian spiritual leader and high priestess on the island whose name was Mikahala Roy. She was honored to do this with us since she wanted to learn more about the Jewish people. She suggested that we meet on the beach in the back of the King Kamehameha Hotel just before sundown on Friday evening. The beach faced the heiau, the sacred site dedicated to one of the major gods in Hawaii named Lano. It's their god of fertility. There she would lead us in a special ceremony, giving us formal permission to do our sacred Shabbat service on the island. I made these arrangements with her on Thursday evening, and she asked that on Friday morning at 7 a.m. I meet her on the beach. She told me that I would bring a special papaya bundle as an offering to their god Lano. Bring an offering to their god, I thought. Oy ve'ezmer, oy oy oy, avodah zarah, idol worship. How can I do this? I didn't tell Mikahala my dilemma, but as soon as I returned to our hotel, I called Reb Zalman. Oy, Reb Zalman, what to do? David Laban, he said, don't worry. Lano is simply one of the aspects of God. As you bring your offering, just chant Hashem Echad, Hashem Echad. God is one. God is one. I replied, okay. So there I was the next morning at the site where there was a statue of Lano in front of me across a very shallow water about 50 feet from the beach. Oy, 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 I was nervous. I knew I was kind of a shaliach, a representative of Judaism to the Hawaiians who were there to witness the offering ceremony. And I wanted to do this in a way that would honor God and our tradition. And I just hoped that there wasn't one of the Chabad rabbis who happened to be walking by at the time I was going to bring this offering. So I was to slosh my way through knee-deep water to get to the site where I'd bring the offering. So there I went, walking into the water, head bowed, arms raised, carrying the bundle like a raised offering described in the Torah, chanting Hashem Echad, Hashem Echad, God is one, God is one. Now the statue of Lano was a figure about 15 feet tall, and it had a very wide mouth with all its upper and lower teeth flashing, presenting a frightening countenance. His look did not help my jitters, but I kept going forward. God is one, Hashem Echad, and thinking of Reb Zalman. About 10 feet from the statue, I started smiling. Then the smile turned into a laugh. As I chanted Hashem Echad again and again, I thought, there I am, a rabbi, sloshing through knee-deep water, bringing a bundle of fruit to a local god. What a funny scene. Well, I looked up, and you know those flashing, ominous-looking teeth of Lano? Suddenly, I swear to you, it seemed to me as if Lano was laughing with me. Laughing with me. I glanced to the side where Mikahala Roy was watching along with another Hawaiian spiritual leader. Their heads were nodding, and they were smiling too. It is as if they were saying, your offering has been accepted. I looked up at Lano, and it was as if he too was saying, your offering has been accepted. And not only did the sacred wooden sculpture in front of me of Lano smile at me, but I felt the presence of my Rebbe, Reb Zalman, behind me. And he too, along with Mikahala Roy, along with Lano, they were smiling as well. What an experience. That evening, Mikahala had prepared 2 sections on the beach with a long canoe used as a mechitza, separating the makeshift men's section from the women's section. Mikahala started chanting a beautiful song in Hawaiian to honor the sacred place where King Kamehameha lived. Then suddenly, from the men's section, Reb Zalman joined in, and simultaneous to Mikahala's chanting in Hawaiian, he started chanting Psalm 95 in Hebrew that we used to welcome in Shabbat, our Queen. What a moment. 2 sacred songs woven together to honor the Hawaiian king and Judaism's queen. Now that's deep ecumenism. That's the kind of interfaith encounter that our Rebbe modeled for us to follow. Good Yontif.
Good evening, everybody. I'm unmuted, I assume. Yes. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, good. I'm going to put my gallery view on so I can see all of your faces while I tell this story. So for about the last 20, 25 years, I've been taking personal retreats. And it started as maybe a writing retreat, then I learned to meditate, and it evolved into just enjoying unplugging for a week and going off in nature. And I have a cabin that I go to. And once about 10 years ago, I had arrived for my retreat. I was in my cabin and I was taking a little walk, and one of the owners of the land, Leslie, came up to me and she said, we have a new path. We built a new trail to the confluence. You can go there in 10 minutes. Now, the confluence is a place on this land where the 2 main creeks, Emigrant Creek and Baldy Creek, come together. And I had been there once, about 10 years prior to that, when on one of my walks, one of the caretakers had popped out from behind a tree and said to me, you have to go to the confluence. It's a power spot. Now, whenever anyone pops out from behind a tree and tells me that I have to go to a power spot, I'm all in. So
I decided to go to the confluence. However, I hadn't really listened for the directions because I was so excited to be going to this power spot. So it took me about 2 hours to get there, during which time I scrambled through brush and I climbed over boulders and kept listening for the roaring and the sound of the water until finally I arrived at the confluence. And it was marked by little piles of rocks, cairns, and I went down and I stared at these waterfalls crashing into each other with the creeks, and I found a little flat rock in the middle of the stream, and I sat on that flat rock and I could feel the mineral warmth of the rock spreading up through my whole body, and I felt the coolness of the water in my hand, and I leaned back and I was laughing. And then I leaned forward and I was weeping. And I leaned back and again, I was laughing and forward weeping, like dancing between two poles, and both were exactly the same. Now, here I was 10 years later, and she said, you could walk to the confluence in 10 minutes. Well, I was immediately wary. I mean, didn't the Jews have to wander for 40 years in the desert before they entered the promised land? I figured a good dose of wandering mixed with some suffering was a prerequisite for any encounter with the divine. I mean, it's kind of the shared memory of our people. So I wasn't going to just go there. I wanted it to be really special, so I decided to prepare. And in order to do that, I sat down and I meditated for a couple of hours. This was one of these sort of long meditation retreats anyway, so I was used to that. And I meditated and meditated until I could feel a kind of soft, calm radiating through my entire being, and I knew I was ready. And then I began walking on the path. And I really wanted to be present. So as I walked, I breathed in, I could breathe in the warm summer air, and I tried to breathe out my thoughts. And the thoughts did come. I didn't want to be distracted, but there they were. And if you're a little bit creative like me, your thoughts might have entire scenarios and whole personalities. And first came Queen Devra, who was planning on getting enlightened at the confluence and then writing a book about it, and then probably going on Oprah, which would necessitate new clothes and maybe jewelry. Well, I parked her with a little crown on her head by a little stream, and I said, see you later. I had to be present, and I kept walking step after step. And then came little Debbie, who had a bad childhood and who is scared of any new experiences, especially if they're going to have contact with true self, which would cause her to be abandoned yet again. And I parked her with an imaginary little doll kind of next to a rock. And I said, I'll soothe you later. And I kept walking. I breathed in, I breathed out. I wanted to be totally present. And finally, I arrived at the entrance to the confluence, and it was marked by a little crossbow and some poles. And I stopped and I said a little prayer. I said, Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, please allow me to be present. And then I didn't even have to walk down to the creek. I was just propelled by a sense of urgency. And I arrived, I could see the cairns that marked the spot. I saw the flat rock where I had been before, and I stopped on the bank and I just stared because the two creeks were cascading into each other, just bursting into praise. I walked down, I sat on that flat rock, and again, I could feel that warm mineral warmth radiating up through my entire body. And I felt the fluttering of the leaves as if they were fluttering inside me. And I could see the veins on the leaves, and they were the same as the veins in my flesh. And the blood that was running through me was the same as the liquid in the water. And everything was completely happening all at the same time. I had never felt so connected to God in my entire life. I felt like I was at the waters of Eden, and I was completely engulfed in the waters. It reminded me of an LSD trip that I had taken in the 70s, actually, where I had sat on my kitchen floor, which was a microcosm of the universe. And there were ants that were walking across the kitchen floor, and I could hear them chattering, and I understood every word they said. Now, I was smart enough not to keep taking LSD at that time. I felt it was too risky. But I remember thinking, sometime before I die, I want to experience that feeling at least one more time again. And it wasn't the feeling of understanding the language of ants. It was the feeling of everything being sublimely interconnected. Adonai Echad. I leaned back on that rock and I shouted out, I love God. Now, I can tell you, I am not normally the kind of person who shouts out or even whispers, I love God. And I actually don't know if I shouted it or whispered it because it was all the same. I'm your usual average God wrestler. I don't know. Is there a God? Do I believe in God? What is God anyway? But here I was shouting out, I love God. And I don't know how long I was there because time actually had no meaning. But eventually, I found my way back to my cabin and took a hot bath and a long nap. Then later in the afternoon, I was wandering around again, but I was still kind of glowing from the experience at the confluence, the cosmic experience. And I ran into the owner, Leslie, again. And I said, Leslie, I went to the confluence. And she said, oh, yeah, nice spot, huh? Nice spot. I didn't know what to say, so I said, uh-huh. But then it kept echoing in my mind, nice spot. Could it be that maybe it was just a nice spot in a different frame of mind? But I didn't want to see it any other way, so I decided not to go back there. Now, a couple of days later, I was getting ready to leave, and I was walking around on the land again, but I was kind of preoccupied. As I said, I was leaving the next day, so I was mentally answering my future email. And then I heard a roaring. And I realized nothing on that land roars like that except for the confluence. I must be near the confluence, but I wasn't on that path. And I realized that I was on a different path on the other side of the confluence, kind of inadvertently. And I thought, well, all I'd have to do is just walk down a little bit from the other side to check it out. And I couldn't resist. So I inched myself down towards the water. And I kind of was taking it from the other side and taking it from the other side of my mind. And I walked down, and first I thought I was in the wrong place because there were two creeks coming together, but it didn't look the same at all. And I looked, there were the little cairns. This must be the confluence. But it was just two creeks coming together with a little waterfall and sunlight sparkling through the trees and birds chirping and water gurgling, and it was a nice spot. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go down on that flat rock. And I sat down there again, and I kind of put my hand in the water to try to get some magic happening. But it was just nice cold water and a nice warm rock. I felt like I was in a sci-fi movie and the pulse of the universe had been stolen by aliens. I thought, where is God's voice whispering through the trees into my heart? Where is the feeling of the pulse of the universe? I don't understand. Everything it's like, I know when Jacob in the Bible is translated into English, the famous words, God is in this place and I knew it not. And I'd always taken that to mean that God is everywhere, whether we're aware of it or not. But now I had it illustrated to me viscerally. Now you see it, now you don't. Now, the question, of course, was, how do I mix that experience in? I'm kind of an all or nothing girl. So if I'm there, I'm all in if I'm really there. And if I'm not, I'm not. But on my way home from the cabin the next day, I was really pondering the question of, how do I mix the experience of the divine, the sacred, into my daily life? I mean, here we are, we're in Shavuot, which is a mini retreat. How do we take whatever is revealed to us here, if we have a revelation on Sinai tonight, how do we take that home and how do we integrate it into our lives? I stopped my car on the way home the next day and I pulled out a pad and I started taking dictation, a crash course on how to mix the sacred into daily life. What could I do so I could take this experience home? And I wrote it on a little yellow sheet of paper, which I have kept for many, many years, and it's faded and worn, but it still has the instructions on mixing the sacred into everyday life. I'm not going to read you all of it, but a few highlights. Meditate and walk outside every day, even if it's brief. And if you're an all or nothing girl like me, even if it's brief is really key here. It doesn't have to be a big epiphany every day. Expect ups and downs. Enjoy the ride. Feel the soft breeze. Hear the bird's song. Enjoy the body you have. Remember to breathe. Keep your feet on the ground. Be patient. God is everywhere, but you just have to show up, and you have to keep showing up every day. Good Yontif.
Thank you, Devra and David. Ki mitzion teitze Torah udvar Adonai mirushalayim. Ki mitzion teitze Torah udvar Adonai mirushalayim. We've been sitting for about an hour here together. Perhaps we need to stretch and dance and take a nice big, if you need to get up and dance a little bit, because we have several other wonderful storytellers. There goes Sunny and Yafa. Letzion teitze Torah var Adonai mirushalayim. There go the Simpsons. Letzion teitze Torah var Adonai mirushalayim. Ki mitzion teitze Torah var Adonai mirushalayim. Ki mitzion. Hey, Reb J. Var Adonai mirushalayim. Yam parapam. I needed that. I don't know about you, but sometimes a good little stretch and to get, so we don't beget these spilkes. This is an illustration that was created by Arthur Kolnick for why L. Peretz's story, a Gilgul Funanigin, a transformation of a melody, the transmigration of a melody. Now, the question this past Shabbat was, why did Yud Hey Vav Hey need to count all of the Yidden, all of the Jews in the desert? Of course, traditionally, the most commentators say because God loves us so. But a Hasidic commentary by the Meorei Naim is that God wants to remind us who we are. And so God takes note of us and counts us. Su'u et Rosh, to lift up literally the head of every single person there. And then the teaching goes on to say that why do we do this? Why do we look not only at our lives as a neshama on the go, from one lifetime to the next? As any melody can transmigrate from one person to the other, because that's tradition too, so do our souls. And the teaching is that we're counted to make sure we know who we are. And that each of us has a name with letters and combination and permutations, just like Bereshit bara Elohim in the beginning, when God created and then gave Adam the job to name all of the animals. What does Adam do? He looks inside and sees the essence of each animal and then names the animal. You are named too. Your name, in some important way, represents your essence. And your essence is about living out the unique purpose of your neshama, of your soul in this lifetime. And so we get busy so many times during the year, right? Certainly during the month of Elul, but also between Pesach and Shavuot, counting the Omer, looking at the Sphira, and each day, each week, working on something about ourselves that needs a little bit of fixing. So the teaching concludes with, if you don't get it right in this lifetime, you're going to have to come back, perhaps many lifetimes, to do the tikkun necessary that your soul lives out its true purpose. A gilgul, a transmigration. We do it. I don't know. Does any of you remember having lived before? Remember that old Crosby, Stills and Nash song? We have all been here before. I remember. And sometimes, as Yogi would say, it seems like deja vu all over again. And so when Rabbi Dan Gordon, otherwise known as Dante, when you told me that you're going to tell a parrot story, I immediately thought of this story. But then you told me that you were going to be telling a story that I've heard 1,000,000 times, because Renée tells the magician. But I have a funny feeling, Dan, that you are going to tell it much differently than Renée does. Please welcome Rabbi Dan Dante Gordon.
Well, thank you so much. And I have not heard Renée's version, but what I've really been excited about, whenever I hear Renée tell, she often tells the same story that I do, tells it differently. And I realize that she's got her way, I've got my way. It's the same story, and we hear it differently. And it's so exciting when you hear the same thing coming from a different perspective. You just had that quote about deja vu all over again, or as Bob Dylan, we just had a teaching recently from Reb David Zaslow about Bob Dylan, and he said, I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. So, as we know, the journey of Shavuot starts at Pesach. And so I thought I would tell a story about Pesach. As Mark said, it was called The Magician by I.L. Peretz. I have adapted it and renamed it as the Happy Heksher. It takes place not that long ago, but pretty long ago, in a very cold, cold place in the world where it was a very harsh winter. And there was a family, a mother, a father, and a young daughter, and they had had a very harsh time during the winter, so harsh that they had to sell just about everything they had. They even sold the furniture. But as things started to warm up in the springtime, they were starting to get hope. And the little girl said, "It's almost Pesach. I'm so thrilled. We're finally going to get out of this cold winter and have a Pesach Seder. Even if we have to sit on the floor because we no longer have table and chairs, we're going to have Pesach together." And her mother and father didn't have the heart to tell her there was no money. There was no money to get chickens and matzah and horseradish and soup and even the utensils and the bowls to eat with. All they had left was the wooden floor and one lonely light bulb dangling from the ceiling. But they didn't have the heart to disappoint their child. And so Mama and Papa scraped together whatever coins they could find. And Mama said, "Go to the village. See if you can find some compassionate souls who will take our little bit of money and add a lot of credit. And perhaps we can at least get enough to make Seder." And so he put his coins in a little purse, went out into the village, and as he got to the village, he saw a crowd gathering. He saw a crowd gathering, and in the midst of the crowd, he couldn't see what was going on, but he heard great applause. And he was looking and trying to find what could he see. And he looked, tipped on his toes, and there, in the middle of the crowd, was a magician who was doing all kinds of fabulous magical tricks. He turned around completely, and his blue shirt turned red. He turned around again, and his red shirt turned blue, and everybody clapped. And then he started pulling things out of his sleeves. He started pulling these scarves. Piles of every scarf was a different color, and every scarf came out. And as soon as he dropped the scarf would drop onto a pile and turn into a flame. And as soon as it left his hand, it turned into a flame and built a little campfire, and everybody clapped. And then he pulled out a scarf that turned into an ice cube, threw the ice cube onto the fire, and the fire went out, and everybody clapped. And it was the time for the piece de resistance. He pulled out of his sleeve a bouquet of flowers. He threw the flowers in the air. The flowers became birds and flew away, and everybody applauded. And then the magician addressed the crowd and said, "For all the magic that you see, don't you have a coin for me? If you like this or you like that, please put something in my hat." And the most magical thing happened. Everybody disappeared. Everybody disappeared as soon as he asked for money, except for our friend, the young Papa, who was mesmerized, who was frozen in space. He couldn't even move. And the magician went right up to him, and he said, "If you please, sir, I'm not greedy. I am just a little needy. So, my friend, what do you say? A coin or two would make my day." And Papa looked at his paltry sum and thought, "Will this even buy a box of matzah?" And he shrugged his shoulders and gave the entire stack of coins to the magician. The magician leaped into the air and said, "What a blessing, what a treat! This Pesach will be extra sweet." And he ran away. And Papa returned home, expecting the disappointment of his wife and daughter. He told them what happened. He told them the excitement that he felt when he saw the magician, his disappointment about not having enough funds. And instead of being sad and teary, his little daughter said, "Well, maybe we could have Pesach again next year. At least we're here together with each other." And her mother and father were just so proud that she expressed that kind of sentiment. And they sat down on the floor. They held hands together, and they said a little Shehechianu, just for being together on Pesach. And just before they could say Amen, there was a knock on the door. Papa went over to the door, he opened it, and who do you think it was? The magician. And the magician said, "Here I am now, let's have fun. This is Seder number 1. You say all who are hungry come and eat, so I'm now hungry, where's my seat?" And Papa looked at him and said, "But magician, this is such a surprise. We don't have a Seder tonight. We didn't have enough funds to make one. I gave you all we had." And the magician said, "Oh, don't be silly, don't be coy. My magic will provide our joy. Don't you fuss and don't you think, 'cause I'll provide our food and drink." And the magician clapped his hands, and the floorboards rose from the floor and formed a table. He clapped his hands again, and the curtains flew off of the windows and spread out into a tablecloth. He clapped his hands again, and floating in from the windows, from the hinges became plates and forks and knives and spoons. And then floating in from the window was food. Terrains of matzo ball soup, roast chicken, matzah, horseradish, haroset, everything. And then the windows came off and formed themselves into paper haggadahs. And 4 place settings were there with haggadahs on them. And then in flew pitchers of wine. Pitchers of wine coming in through the window, and the wine floated over the cups and poured wine into the cups without spilling a single drop. And the magician said, "Now it's time for us to dine." But the little girl looked at everything at the table. She saw the haggadahs, the bitter herbs, the egg, the bone. She saw the haggadahs, she saw the wine, and she said, "Something's missing. Where is Elijah's cup?" The magician said, "How could I forget that sage? I must be getting on in age. One small error without malice. The prophet shall have a special chalice." And he stomped his foot on the ground, and the light bulb fell off of the ceiling, bounced on the table, formed itself into a goblet, and then another bottle of wine came, floated in, filled up the goblet all the way to the top. Now it's time to take our seat. Let's sit down and prepare to eat. But the little girl once again had a confused look on her face. She said, "I don't know about this. When we buy our Pesach food, at the store, it all has a little label on it. It says, kosher lePesach. How do we know that this food is kosher? Well, her mother and father looked at her like, you don't take a gift like this and thumb your nose at it. But the magician said, what a wise and clever child. And the girl said, we won't start eating until we know it's kosher. I think we need to talk to the rabbi. Well, what a wise and clever child. Surely we can wait a while. Do go see what your rabbi has to say. And while you're gone, I'll wait, I'll stay. I'm sure he'll authorize my knack. Then hurry, hurry, hurry back. And so they went off and they left the magician at their house. And they went and they found the rabbi who was just about to start his own Seder. They told him the entire story about the magician entertaining people in the square. They told him all about what happened and about how the magician had conjured up an entire Seder. The rabbi listened carefully and said, I don't know about magic. I've never heard about anything like this. But if what you've told me is true, your visitor is one interesting visitor, and you might just have invited to your Seder the one who we're all waiting for. So go back and enjoy your Seder, and I'm sure it will be the most kosher Seder you could ever experience. They wandered back to their home, went in, and they could smell the aroma of all the wonderful food that was there. But they couldn't find the magician. Magician, magician, where are you? The rabbi said it's fine. We're ready to have Seder now. Where are you? They looked all around, and they couldn't find him. But they saw his hat dangling on one of the chairs, and Elijah's cup was empty. This annual event is such a delight. Chag Sameach to all, and to all a good night.
ושמחת וחגך והיית שמח ושמחת וחגך. Let's give it up for Rabbi Dan. Ach sameach, yai rai rai rai, yalai rai rai di rai rai, yalalai yalalai, yai rai rai rai, yalai di rai di rai rai, yalalai rai yai 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 yai. So it's not that I am greedy, and neither am I needy, but in the chat will be posted our website. If you would think you might want to return to another gathering, whether it be Shabbat morning or some other time during the week, get in our mailing list and you'll get our bi-weekly emails. Also, if you are so moved to make a donation in honor of this evening, 100% of all the money that you donate will go to the World Central Kitchen. Ya la 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 la, ya 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 ya, did it la 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 la, ya ya la 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 la. V'samachta v'chagecha v'hayita sameach. I don't know about you all, but I'm in a state of wow. That's where I'm living right now, in the state of wow. I want to share something with you from a book that I'm holding here, and I'll tell you what the book is in a moment. But here's what the author writes. The author writes, just as we are born with the capacity for language acquisition, we are all born with an abundance of story, intelligence, potential. Story is, in a profound sense, every human being's native language. Mastering this language can be enhanced if it's better understood and practiced. It's not reliant on where you come from, whether you're rich or poor, or how much you know, or your intellectual development. This capability weaves its way into every aspect of human discourse. Storytelling makes it possible for us to share our experience of the past and paint a picture of our aspirations for the future. It's crucial to helping us learn and grow, develop, and understand our role in our families, our organizations, and society. Because we're storytelling creatures, early humans looked at the heavens and were awed, seeing in the sky a panoply of characters, animals, and familiar objects. And by creating stories about these bodies, people endowed them with a human dimension, giving the stars a sense of purpose and meaning. And isn't that where story leads us to? It's a place where the left brain cannot reach on its own. It is a portal to divinity that otherwise might go unexplored. Reb Zalman used to say that a good Maisa, a good story, is one where the mind surprises the heart. So we're listening to a story up here. We think we're listening it up here in the world of Bria, in the world of thought, but really, eventually, that story will lead us right here in the kishkis, in the same way that a good lick from your puppy will as well. And all of that is to introduce our next teller, who is a Moshnik and the author of Story Intelligence. Please welcome Rick Stone.
Thank you, Reb Mark, and a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. And I was like, I think, who wrote this? This another person talking about story intelligence. My God. So by late May of 1988, the question returned like a sacred ritual for us. Where would we hike this year? My friend Ron, meticulous as ever, had already mapped out possibilities. I welcomed this trip more than in the past, looking for a respite from a painful breakup with someone I loved. But neither of us knew we were about to walk into something far stranger than just another trailhead. Ron and I had met years earlier in graduate school, two strangers in the chlorinated quiet of the Peabody Pool, unaware that our shared laps would birth a shared love for the silence of ridges, for the conversation of wind and trees, for the communion only a trail can offer. He'd introduced me to backpacking, and we'd walk much of America together, but never the Cascades. That was Ron's latest offering. Glaciers, he said, ancient ones, hikeable, majestic, and best of all, the elevation changes were reasonable. That was code for you'll survive. Joining us would be Ron's wife, Carolyn, and a new colleague of his named Joni. August was set. The plan, as always, came with Ron's infamous punch list. Part packing guide, part dinner menu. The description of items was as copious as it was detailed. 3 pairs of underwear, 2 pounds of Gorp snack to sustain us, 1 bungee cord, spaghetti with white clam sauce made the menu again. A strange but now sacred tradition that I had maybe foolishly initiated years before. It was my dish, my task. The ritual remained. It was a messy affair cooking this delectable feast in the outdoors with a small portable stove, but after being on the trail for several days, eating freeze-dried meals originally designed for astronauts, it was a scrumptious reward for hiking 7 or 8 miles with 2,500 feet of elevation change. But it did come with an added danger. The pungent aroma of clams made us a magnet for bears and other critters, and then there was the added issue of what to do with any leftovers. Seattle-Tacoma Airport greeted us under a rare sun. Remarkably, we landed within minutes of each other, 4 converging from corners of the country like threads being pulled through the same needle. Joni arrived with a fresh gear recently bought from REI. Her boots were unbroken, inexperienced like her to the rigors of the trail. Ron and I exchanged the glance seasoned hikers give when faced with brand new boots. Compassion mixed with caution. My pack strained to the seams, but I had made space for one more companion, Sinai, the great and terrible wilderness. Bernstein's reflective retracing of the Exodus journey. It was one man's attempt to replicate the excursion of the Hebrews through the wilderness, concluding with his trek up Mount Sinai in search of the revelations that occurred there thousands of years ago. I didn't know it then, but that choice would echo in strange and sacred ways. I too was on a journey, hoping to escape from the constricting pain of a broken heart, longing to find in the Cascades wilderness a new bearing, a fresh hope for tomorrow. I suppose I too was searching for a mythical promised land. Our goal for the trip was to visit Sahali Glacier in the heart of the Cascades. To get there, though, required more than a car and our feet. We drove to Lake Stehekin, where we boarded the Lady of the Lake ferry for the 10-mile journey to the far end of the mile-wide lake, where we'd find the Cascades Pass trailhead. It was the only way into the wilderness. The weather was sunny and warm, and our spirits were high. And when we disembarked, we checked all the gear, found the trailhead, and then headed out into the hush of the wilderness. After about 4 miles of hiking, we made camp for the first night, protected by a canopy of fir trees. Joni sat down silently, her face pale with pain, as she unpeeled her socks. Her heels were raw, swollen, split open in angry blisters that seeped blood. She winced, trying to hide her anguish behind a brave smile. It was clear she couldn't go on, not like this. I reached into my pack and pulled out my old pair of Tai Chi shoes. Simple cloth, thin rubber soles, little more than a whisper between foot and ground. Try these, I said. It felt absurd, almost cruel to offer her slippers on a trek this rugged. But the Hebrews, after all, probably made their journey through the Sinai with nothing more supportive. After applying Dr. Scholl's pads to cover the open wounds, she layered 2 pairs of socks and slipped them on, stood up and took a step. Then another. These might actually work, she whispered, eyes wide as if hope had just stepped back into view. The next morning, when she loaded her pack on her back and stepped onto the trail, amazingly, she was smiling and managed the remainder of the trip with these flimsy excuses for shoes. That first night, after slipping into my small tent and sleeping bag, I brought out my flashlight and began reading Sinai, the Great and Terrible Wilderness. I imagine it was much like the wild terrain we had been hiking, minus the towering green pines and snow-peaked mountains in the distance, and of course, streams of water cascading down from every hillside. The narrative was absorbing and compelling as it retold the story of the Exodus from slavery to freedom. God appeared as a hovering cloud. When it moved, the people followed. Sometimes at night it became a burning fire, but most of the time it would descend on the tent of meeting, and God's kavod would dwell there. Over the Hebrews' 40 years of trekking through the wilderness, this mysterious cloud would hover above the sanctuary, and that's when God would speak to Moses, counseling him, downloading wisdom from some etheric plane. Each night on our trip, weary and sore, I would fall asleep pondering this miracle that seemed less remote to me now that I was also on a journey through the wild outdoors, albeit nearly 3,300 years removed from the time when God last made himself known in such a visible yet guarded form. I wondered, were the ancients so different from us? Tired, sore, searching, and searching for what? And what was I seeking in this wondrous wilderness? On our third day out, our goal was Sahali Glacier. We expected to arrive by mid-afternoon, even though the trail ascended another 4,000 feet, leaving us plenty of time to explore the glacier before dinner. I led the way, head down, breath rhythmic, when I noticed something unusual just as we began to ascend again. A soft blur of motion caught my eye. It was a gray jay, its wings flashing silver in the light, landed directly in front of me. It tilted its head, as if assessing me, and then began hopping slowly up the trail. Step by step, I followed. Every few moments, it would look back and then continue hopping forward. If I paused, it paused. If we rested, it waited. Not once did it startle or retreat. When we broke for lunch, the jay reappeared, perching on a nearby rock. I held out a walnut in my palm. It fluttered down, bold and trusting, and took the offering. In all my years hiking, I never had a companion like this. It felt sacred, as if the mountain had sent a scout, a guide. Only once before I had come this close to another species in the wilderness, a marmot at 13,000 feet near the Keyhole in Rocky Mountain National Park. This giant rodent was as fearless as a small gray jay, wandering out of its lair, curious about who would dare intrude on its private home, sniffing our shirts and shoes to satisfy himself that we were not apparitions. For at least 2 miles of our hike that day, this feathered friend accompanied us like an ally to ensure our safe passage. It was odd, but also comforting, and in a strange way familiar. The gray jay had abandoned us by the time we arrived at the campsite for Sahali Glacier. Ahead of us, we could see it looming like a mythic structure from long ago. We set up our tents and took a snack for the short hike up to the glacier's face. A wall of ice over 100 feet high is something to behold. It was streaked with mud, bacterial pink layers, and cerulean blue streaks like it had borrowed it from its hue from the sky. Now, there's one important piece of the story I haven't shared with you yet. Caroline, for several years, had been channeling what we had come to know as the guides, entities from the ethereal realm who took a keen interest in our human affairs, always willing to provide insight and suggestions for us as we faced challenging decisions. It's not something she did publicly. It was always in private with Ron as scribe, because after awakening from these trances, Carolyn would have no memory of what she said or what was said to her. Only I and a small handful of close friends had previously taken part in these sessions. Well, we thought it would be really interesting to hold a session there at the base of the glacier. After a snack, we gathered in a small circle. Carolyn closed her eyes for a few moments, but then opened them, whispering that something wasn't right. The energy vortexes were too strong and she felt extremely exposed. We all agreed to postpone our session to later that evening back in our campsite. After dinner, and as dusk turned to night, a nearly full moon rose to our east, illuminating the cloudless sky and the glistening glacier. That's when I noticed a cloud to our west that began to snake its way across the clear sky. It was unlike any cloud I'd ever seen, flowing like it was contained in a tube, tightly held together as it moved across the horizon. We sat mesmerized by this strange phenomena. That's when Carolyn noticed in the east a bright light. I wondered if it was a planet like Venus, but it wasn't in the place one would expect it to be. I only learned recently from Carolyn after our trip, she visited some friends in nearby Billingham. When she mentioned this eerie light in the sky, they were not surprised. For years now, they and others have been seeing this inexplicable phenomena and come to refer to it as the mothership. Over the next hour, the cloud, impossibly deliberate, spiraled like a silk thread from some unseen loom in the heavens. It eventually stopped above the glacier, where it began to circulate counterclockwise, swirling slowly as it continued to be fed by the thin wisp of a cloud from the east. It crowned the glacier like a halo over a sleeping god. Slowly, reverently, it descended, not in a rush, but as if summoned by ancient voices, and then, without warning, it rolled toward us, wrapping the valley in fog, in mystery, in its presence. I was keenly aware of the parallels of my feelings of awe and amazement and what the Hebrews must have felt when they first observed God appearing as a cloud that descended upon Mount Sinai, and then daily upon the tent of meeting. Within 30 minutes, we were enveloped in a thick fog that obscured our sight of the glacier or any of the surrounding mountains. Perhaps wisely, we chose then to find cover in Ron and Carolyn's tent, and she suggested that this would be a good time to invite the guides to descend from on high. Sitting cross-legged, she closed her eyes, her body jerking lightly a few times, and then the guides began to speak like the oracle of old, addressing our human concerns as a mystery outside shrouded us. My questions for the guides revolved around love. Would I ever find it again? Would my broken heart heal from the crack that had opened there, much like a cleave in the glacier looming in the shroud of the fog in the distance? I've long since forgotten the actual words spoken by the guides that evening, but I recollect that they counseled me to be patient. Within a year, God did provide a response that would change the path of my life. What exactly did we witness on that August night in 1988? A weather event? An illusion? Or was it something older, something sacred passing through the veil that usually hides such mysteries? As the cloud descended and wrapped us in silence, it felt less like nature and more like a spiritual invitation. Awe took root in the soil of our ordinary encampment that evening, and in that hush I sensed what it might mean to meet the divine, not in temples or texts, but in the miracle of fog and feather, glacier and light. Or perhaps what I was experiencing was a 3,000-year-old memory of having stood with the Hebrews at the base of Mount Sinai. I won't claim certainty, only presence. The kind that doesn't explain, only transforms.
Amen. Thank you, Rick. Amen.
Thank you.
Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we listened to each other with the same quality of listening that we've been listening to our tellers this evening? There's something so delicious. It's almost like a mikveh of words that lead us to places where we couldn't go otherwise. It leaves me in awe of all the tellers this evening. We have one more teller. Will bring us home. But something else has left me in awe, which you wouldn't be aware of, since I asked for your generosity to making donations that would go to the World's Central Kitchen. I was given a private chat that a generous moshnik, or I'm not even sure if this person is a moshnik, but a generous person who has...
Generous Moshnik.
Thank you, Renée. A generous moshnik has offered to match what we raised tonight up to $10,000. If you don't know Jose Andres, the chef from Washington, D.C., and his holy work, you should. Just look up World Central Kitchen. All over the world, they offer their services, their love. And some of you might remember the tragic incident in Gaza where a number of their workers were killed. And still they continue the work. So I encourage you to, whenever you're comfortable doing it, after Chag, moshdc.org/donate. And I'll know, because who you are, that it was going to there. So last but not least, our final teller, who earlier on, before you all got here, told a story that many years ago at the Cage conference, in which she was telling stories, there were 500 people awaiting the storytelling event, and every teller went way longer than they were supposed to. And so by the time Renée, who was the last teller, went up onto the stage to perform, there were like a dozen people, Renée? I don't remember how many you say they were. Somewhere around there. So I also want to thank our tellers this evening for being machmir, for being, really right on about the amount of time, because I wanted this to be within a certain time period between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And it looks like we're going to land pretty darn close to there. So keep in mind the story that Dante told, because Renée's story might have some echoes of that for you. Renée Brachfeld, who's right downstairs from where I sit. Please welcome her.
Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, is one of the most popular characters in all of Jewish folklore, in the sense that there are more stories about Elijah than just about anybody else. Perhaps he captured the popular imagination because he never died. He was lifted up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And now, in Jewish folklore, in stories, he comes back to the world. He visits people. He brings them gifts. He sometimes brings them the one thing they really need. And in some of the stories, Elijah comes back to see how they're using the gifts they've been given. And sometimes he even revokes the gifts if he doesn't approve. But they say he comes in disguise. You never know. He might come as a rich man or a beggar, a musician, a magician, or a thief. They say you never can tell when you meet a stranger if it might not be the prophet Elijah. But I wasn't actually planning to tell you a story tonight about the prophet Elijah. I want to tell you a story about me. Now, many of you know me as a storyteller, and I've been earning my living as a storyteller for nearly 40 years. But you might not know that I didn't begin my career performing as a storyteller. I began performing professionally as a juggler. Now, how I became a juggler is a whole other story in its own right, and I'm not actually going to tell you that right now because, well, it's a story for another time. But in any case, so I became a juggler. Now, I never set out to be a juggler. It just kind of came upon me, and I started performing in all kinds of venues. I performed in nightclubs and street festivals and traveled around. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, and I traveled around the Southeast performing, street performing as a juggler. And I was eking out a living. I was managing to pay my rent, but I never really saw juggling as my life's work. I was raised to think that I was going to do something of substance and meaning in the world. And I never quite felt like juggling was going to be that thing, but I was enjoying it. It was fun. And so that's what I was doing. And it worked well enough. And then, but I was doing street shows and nightclubs and performing in places where, you know, what Dante described, you put out your hat at the end of the show and the crowd disperses. And then one day somebody invited me to perform on stage. Now, the difference between a street act and being on stage is that when you're on stage, you generally have a specific amount of time to fill. And I had been performing at that point with a partner. And then I started to get the urge to perform by myself. And I had just broken away from performing as a duo and decided to perform on my own. I get this stage show. I'm standing on stage, and because I am bad at planning in advance, I had 45 minutes for this program, and I hadn't really considered the fact that without my partner, I didn't really have 45 minutes of material. So I'm standing on stage. I do this juggling bit that I've worked out, and I do that juggling bit that I've worked out. But I'm realizing that I'm getting towards the end of the different juggling pieces that I have to offer, and there is a substantial amount of time left for people to be watching me. So I stopped juggling and I told the audience a story. It was a story that my dad used to tell us all the time, a story that he told us whenever we complained. So I'd heard the story a lot. And they really liked it. So I did another little bit of juggling, and then I told them another story, and they listened. And the quality of it was different. And so I got through that show doing a little bit of juggling and telling a story, and I did the whole show, and it was a huge success. So I did another show like that, and another. I really liked the stories. I could see that they did the thing I wanted. It wasn't just entertaining. It was really touching people's hearts. I began to study up on stories of all kinds. I read extensively. I interviewed people. I started researching stories of all kinds, but especially Jewish stories. And I began to perform more and more. I performed in many places. I still called myself a juggler, and I went around and I performed. And in between the juggling bits, I told them all these stories I was learning. And one night, I performed in a small town in North Carolina. And as had been happening, everybody loved the show. I finished what I was doing. Everybody applauded. And as the people dispersed, a man came up to me and he said, "You know, I really liked your show, but you're not really a juggler." And I was a little taken aback because I knew that, but nobody else ever seemed to notice. But he seemed generally positive. So I said, "Well, if I'm not a juggler, what do you think I am then?" And without a moment's hesitation, he said, "You're a storyteller." And I had never heard the word used that way. You're a storyteller. But I realized immediately that that was true. That was what I was. It was 40 years ago. People weren't talking about storytelling then the way they are now, but it was right. I was a storyteller. And so I went back to Atlanta where I lived. I told everyone I was a storyteller, and I've been working as one ever since. And several years later, I was performing, I began booking myself at all kinds of different venues as a storyteller. And at one point, I was invited to perform at a synagogue. And this is long before I met Mark. And I was brought in, the synagogue in South Carolina was having a scholar in residence weekend. And they had invited a rabbi to be their scholar, Rabbi Steve Sager, and they invited me to be their storyteller for the weekend. And we took turns. He would teach, and then I would do some storytelling, and we alternated over the weekend. And at lunch on Shabbat afternoon, I was sitting with this visiting rabbi, and he asked me how I became a storyteller. And I told him the story that I just told to you. And he said, "Oh, that man, do you know who he was? The man who told you that you were a storyteller, do you know who he was?" And I said, "No, I never saw him before." And he said, "Yeah, do you know who he was?" I said, "No." "You may have already guessed." He said, "That man, that was the prophet Elijah." So that's how I became a storyteller. And now I want to tell you a story. Once there was a young man, a boy really, 12, 13 years old, who was taken to study with a rabbi, a man who was both very old and very wise. And at first, when the boy went to study with the rabbi, he loved it. The rabbi, he was so old and so wise. He knew the answer to every question. The boy could ask and ask and ask, and the rabbi would answer and answer and answer. And at first, the boy loved it. But after a while, it began to irritate him. It began to annoy him that for every question he had, the rabbi had an answer. The young man started to think, if the rabbi knows the answer to all the questions and I don't know any of them, I must be stupid. And so, in order to make himself feel better, this young man decided that he would try and catch his teacher in a mistake. He went out and studied up on all kinds of arcane and esoteric points of law, just so that he would be able to ask a question that the rabbi could not answer correctly. But for every question the boy asked, the rabbi had an answer. The boy grew angrier and angrier. And at last, in his anger, he thought of a question that he was sure his teacher could not answer correctly. So this young man went out, and he caught in his hands a tiny baby bird. And holding the bird in his hands, the young man went and he stood before his teacher. And he said, "Rabbi, answer my question." The rabbi, very old and very wise, he said, "Ask, my son." "What do I have in my hands?" Now, here, the boy thought for sure he had the rabbi, because he had that baby bird in his hands, and he thought, if the rabbi says the bird is dead, he said, now, it's late at night, and I've gotten ahead of myself in the story. He said, "What do I have in my hands?" And the rabbi, he looked at the young man, and he saw the yellow beak striving to be free, saw the little feathers protruding from between his fingers. He said, You have a baby bird in your hands, my son." "Yes," said the boy, "but answer me this. Is the bird alive, or is he dead?" Now here, he felt for sure that he had the rabbi, because if the rabbi said the bird was dead, the boy intended to open his hands and show him a living bird, and the rabbi would be mistaken. So great was this young man's need to be correct and to have his teacher be mistaken, that if the rabbi said the bird was living, the boy intended to crush that bird between his hands, just so that the teacher would be mistaken. The rabbi, very old and very wise, he saw the anger and belligerence in the young man's face. He saw how much he wanted to be right, and he understood what was about to happen. And so the rabbi hesitated, not answering the question, until the young man said again, "I said, is the bird alive or is it dead?" The rabbi drew in a deep breath, and he looked that young man straight in the eyes. And he said, "The answer to your question, my son, is in your hands."
Thank you, Renee. It is late at night here in DC, but not as late as it's going to be for those people who are headed to somewhere else for some more teaching, more stories. I want to thank our tellers tonight. I am so grateful. Shulamit Fagan, Rabbi Dan Goldblatt, Rabbi David Zaslow, Devra Zaslow, Rabbi Dan Dante Gordon, Rick Stone, and Renée Brachfeld. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Let's end with a lullaby for those of us who have visions of pajamas and sugar plums in our... If you don't have any plans tomorrow morning, we're having services at 10 o'clock right here in the synagogue with another wonderful storyteller who's going to be joining us, Rabbi Simcha Raphael, with an extended teaching on the book of Ruth. Like I said, we are just like a brick and mortar shul, without the bricks, without the mortars, but with the joy and with the community in which we're so blessed to be in. So let's sing each other a lullaby. Some of you might know it. A long time ago, Chris Williamson wrote this song. Like a ship in the harbor, like a mother and child, like a light in the darkness, I'll hold you a while. We'll rock on the water, I'll cradle you deep and hold you while angels sing you to sleep. Come on, let's sing it together. Like a ship in the harbor, like a mother and child, like a mother and child, like a light in the darkness, like a light in the darkness, I'll hold you a while, I'll hold you a while. We'll rock on the water, I'll cradle you deep, I'll cradle you deep, and hold you while angels sing you to sleep, and hold you while angels sing you to sleep. Chag Sameach, everyone.